Hi all, Dr. Clark here, Gen Bio lecture on ionization of water, which is kind of a fancy term for pH, okay, and the fact that water sometimes will spontaneously break apart into hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions, okay. And so that's really what we're going to cover today, is kind of that ionization, or what's going on with pH. Okay, so we know this much, and you probably already know because we've talked about it before, that water is highly polar, which means it's a polar molecule, which means that it has one charge, negative charge on one side of the molecule, and a positive charge on the other side of the molecule. So when in solution, it will try to form as many hydrogen bonds as possible. And so if other polar molecules are in solution with water, it'll form hydrogen bonds with that other polar molecule. This is what makes water a excellent solvent, okay? Which is often called the universal solvent, okay? Because it can dissolve many things, and dissolving really just means that it forms bonds with it. And so you can put salt in, with water, and eventually, it becomes incorporated into the same solution. Okay? Now, molecules that can form bonds with water, okay, are considered hydrophilic. Okay, so they're attracted to water. Now, attraction is not a real scientific term. What it's meant is that they will bond, or will allow water to bond with them. Okay, and so polar molecules will often form hydrogen bonds. Okay, or a hydrogen bond will be formed between that molecule, that polar molecule, and a water molecule. Okay. Now, hydrophobic molecules, okay, are molecules that are often repelled by water. Okay. So in other words, no bonds are formed. Okay, no hydrogen bonds are formed, and these are non-polar molecules. So they don't have a positive and negative side to the molecule. The molecule itself is a neutral molecule, and therefore hydrogen bonds will not form. Okay? So that kind of brings us to ionization, or water ionization. Okay? Now, even though last time we talked about covalent bonds, and how covalent bonds are much stronger than ionic bonds, and they're much stronger than hydrogen bonds, occasionally even a covalent bond will break spontaneously. When it does, and it's water, it breaks like this. So a water molecule will break up into hydroxide ions and hydrogen ions. Okay? Why that's important, okay, and we call that ionization because ions are created, okay, or result from the breaking of that water molecule. So here's a hydroxide ion, here's a hydrogen ion, and that is ionization, spontaneous formation of ions. This is important because it allows us to look at solutions and categorize a solution by how many or how much of the solution is free hydrogen ions and how much of the solution is free hydroxide ions. Okay? And that's really where pH comes. Now, like I said before, this does occur. It doesn't occur all that often, but it occurs enough, especially with water molecules, that we have designed an entire pH table, or we have an entire study of pHs that's based on this concept, water being ionized, or going through the ionization process. Okay? The most convenient way, at least the most convenient way that we currently use, is to express the number of hydrogen ions as a pH. Okay? So in other words, pH is equal to the negative log of hydrogen ions. So the pH system, or the pH table, is a log-based system. Okay? So in other words, it's logarithmic, and one unit change is a tenfold change in the hydrogen ion concentration. So if you're moving from a pH of 7 to a pH of 6, then you have 10 times the number of hydrogen ions in a pH of 6 than you would in a pH of 7. And so you can see here, this is just a typical pH scale, okay, running from 0 to 14. Okay, and it's based purely on how many hydrogen ions you have in concentration. If we look at a pH of 7, which is pure water, and blood is nearly pH 7, okay, but pure water is a pH of 7, which means if you counted or calculated how many hydrogen ions are in the concentration, it would be roughly, if it's identical 7, okay, if the exact number is 7, then it's going to have the exact number, okay, of hydroxide ions. Hydroxide ions and hydrogen ions would be the same. Now the water that we consume and the blood that we have is not exactly 7. Okay? It's close, okay? But often it's not exactly 7. That's why we label here pure water. Okay? So this would be distilled many, many times and would have nothing but water molecules, okay, and some spontaneously broken water molecules in the form of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. Okay. You increase the number of hydrogen ions in a solution, you go down the pH scale. Okay? You're lowering the pH. Okay? And so something like hydrochloric acid has a huge number of hydrogen ions compared to hydroxide ions in solution. Okay? You reverse the pH going the opposite way. So if you're taking hydrogen ions out of solution, okay, or there's less free hydrogen ions, you're increasing the pH. Okay? You're moving in the opposite direction. So something like a pH of 14, sodium hydroxide, would have far more hydroxide ions than hydrogen ions. Okay? And the reason why we talk about this a lot in general biology is that a lot of our systems, a lot of our enzymes, a lot of the biochemical pathways that we deal with, okay, a lot of organisms, whether that be organisms like their ecological niches or where they're found, they encounter very different pH values. Okay? But the pH itself, okay, can dictate where an organism can go, where an organism can live, whether or not an enzyme even works. Okay? So it's important to know that pH values are a tenfold difference, okay, and it's based on how many hydrogen ions are in solution. Okay? All right, so moving from there, though, we can talk about, again, just kind of overview, and we talk about pure water has a pH of 7, exactly 7. And that means there's an equal number of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. Okay? An acid, like I said before, is anything that has more hydrogen ions than pure water. Okay? So therefore you're going down the pH value, and it would have a pH value below 7. And a base is anything that has less hydrogen ions than pure water, okay? And therefore the pH value is up above 7. Okay? Now, like I said before, when we're talking about enzymes and environments and things like that, most organisms live in an environment that is close to 7. It's not going to be exactly 7, okay? But it's close to 7. So that means that most organisms' proteins, okay, that are involved with biochemical pathways and enzymes and things like that, and just building blocks of normal tissue proteins have a optimal pH somewhere around 7. Now if you change that, if you make it more acidic, okay, you can start to unravel those proteins. Okay? You'll start to denature those proteins. We'll get to these points in later lectures. Okay? But sometimes you have pHs that are extremely acidic or extremely basic, and so you might think of your stomach acid, or you think of dissolving food. So there are parts of our body and other organisms' bodies that have a very acidic range, or maybe even a very basic range. Okay? And you would often see that organisms would encounter these, okay, by consuming food, okay, and going through digestion, or occupying areas that are very basic, maybe in the case of like saltwater organisms, okay. The oceans are more basic than a freshwater system, so they'd occupy these quite a bit. Okay? So also the items at which an organism decides to consume, whether that be like food items or aquatic items like water or different types of drinks and things like that. From a human standpoint, soda, beer, wine, these kind of things can really change or really have an effect on the organism's internal environment. Okay? So to minimize the disturbance, that effect that those items might have, we use buffers. But we're not the only one that uses buffers, and it's often thought that humans have created medicine. Okay? But far before humans created medicine, other organisms, have utilized different things in their environment, different abilities to move to new environments, okay? And consumption of different plant products or minerals to minimize disturbances. And pH is also included in this. Okay? So an organism that might be consuming a lot of meat, okay, and producing a lot, a high pH or pH disturbance, so not high, okay. What I mean by high is a lot of acid, okay. So when you consume meat, you produce a lot of acids or have the potential to have a lot of free hydrogen ions. And by doing that, okay, you might cause an upset stomach, okay, heartburn, things like this, by consuming a lot of meat products, okay? And that's just part of the result. So as a buffer, you might consume material like calcium or calcium carbonate, okay, and try to reduce the effect of pH. Okay? Now these buffers will take up hydrogen ions or release hydrogen ions. It really just depends on what the disturbance is. Do you have too many hydrogen ions in solution? Okay. Then you want to take a buffer that picks up some of those hydrogen ions. Okay. Do you have too few hydrogen ions in solution? Then you want something that releases hydrogen ions into solution. Okay. And that's kind of how a buffer works. Now, I'm not telling you that buffers remove acids or bases. Okay. It's just removing free hydrogen ions or producing free hydrogen ions. Okay? So it's not changing the acidity or the base of the blood or your stomach acid or anything like that. That's not the point. It's changing the effect of these free hydrogen ions or lack of free hydrogen ions on the system. Okay? And then most of the time when we talk about buffers, we talk about paired substances, especially when we start talking about how other organisms can use buffers to minimize the disturbance in solution. Okay? And that brings me to this video. Okay, so we're going to play this video, and this video talks about how other organisms can self-medicate. Okay? We'll talk about this, we'll come back to this when we talk about human evolution and we talk about other organisms evolving and learning and things like that. But it's well known now that other organisms have the capability of self-medicating. Okay? We self-medicate. So you have too much acid, okay? You go out and you pop some Tums or some Rolaids or whatever your antacid that is preferred by you, whatever company or brand or whatever works best for you, we take it, okay, to pick up the free hydrogen ions. Okay? And we can look at how other organisms have this capability also.
I think humans invented medicine, but animals have been self-medicating for millions of years. Even the humble bee. When bumblebees get infected by dangerous parasites, they have a way of dealing with their sickness, visiting plants whose pollen and nectar have chemical compounds that help flush the parasites from their systems. Scientists believe these bees know what they're doing. The compounds, iridoid glycosides, are actually a kind of poison that healthy bees want to avoid. So, like humans taking prescription drugs, bees only tend to seek them out when they're sick. But bees don't just take medicine for themselves. They may also be bringing it back to the hive and transforming it into honey, so that larvae and the queen can eat it. Self-medication also happens at the colony level. When a honeybee colony is exposed to a fungal infection, it will send bees out to fortify the nest with plant resin, which has antimicrobial properties that help the whole colony fight off the fungus. Thanks, hive mind. Now, you probably already know that bees around the planet are in trouble. So here's one way scientists say you can help. Make your garden into a bee pharmacy by planting thyme, sunflowers, turtlehead flowers, and even wild tobacco. Help the bees help themselves.
What the video is talking about is the ability for bees to self-medicate. Okay? But apart from that, we know that lots of organisms have this capability. There are many publications on elephants self-medicating, chimpanzees self-medicate, gorillas self-medicate, monkeys self-medicate, butterflies self-medicate, there are fish that self-medicate, and it's really an interesting, integral part of the biology of lots of organisms. Okay? You have the capability of self-medicating because you know there's something wrong, and other organisms have this capability also. And the something wrong, in the case of ionization or in the case of use of buffers, is that your body is telling you that you have too many free hydrogen ions or too little free hydrogen ions. Just like your body tells you when you're thirsty, when you're hungry, even when you're sleepy, okay, or have not slept enough, okay, your body will tell you the same things. Okay? So the pH is very important. We'll talk about it when we talk about enzymes. We'll talk about it when we talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Okay? And just realize that when we talk about chemistry, okay, again, you have to know something about chemistry in order to understand biology. Okay? And it's this chemistry that can really drive the behavior of organisms, not just humans, but the behavior of all organisms. Okay? So with that, we're going to talk and switch to biomolecules, and we'll start talking about some specific biomolecules next time.